Welcome everyone to the second talk of the term. This is an event co-hosted by the Plurilingual Lab Speaker Series, the Identity, Language and Diversity Research Group, as well as DISE Research Talk. Thank you all for being here virtually with us today. Today we're very happy and grateful to welcome, especially in these very challenging and uncertain times, to be welcoming Dr. Li Wei from the Institute of Education at the University College London, who will deliver a talk entitled Multi-competence, Translanguaging and Mobile Self-Directed Learning. So his talk will be based on a conceptual paper that aims to extend the concept of linguistic competence, as well as advance translanguaging as a research perspective. Dr. Li Wei will also provide empirical examples from self-directed mobile language learning to demonstrate the relevance of the translanguaging approach for bilingual and multilingual teaching and learning. Dr. Li Wei will have 1 hour for the talk, which will be video recorded. Here are just a few words about Zoom etiquette. So during the talk, please keep your video and sound off. However, you can use the thumbs up and hands clapping features to show your appreciations and interact with the speaker. As I said, the talk will be video recorded and available in the Plurilingual Lab YouTube channel in a few days. Now, after the talk, there will be a 30-minute discussion period that will not be recorded, during which you can post your questions in the chat or unmute yourself and ask a question live. The discussion will be moderated by Paul and Ben, so please don't hesitate to post your questions in the chat room. So I will now stop sharing my screen so that Dr. Li Wei can share his. So enjoy the talk, everyone, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. That's a really wonderful introduction. It really explains the focus of my talk today. I'm just sharing my slides first, and I have to do this checking. Can you see my slides? Yeah? You can? Okay, right. So, this year, I'm sure all of you have realized that online learning and online communication is playing such a huge role in our everyday life. I think this year in particular, of course, for obvious reasons. I have been interested in online learning for some time, and of course, all of us do learn a great deal of different things online, using online platforms, online resources. If you look at the research available on online learning, especially online language learning, the focus tends to be on the technological affordances and on the teaching side of online learning as well. So what the technology can afford us to do, and how we make good use of the technical side of this environment in terms of learning. Similarly, in the research that's available on self-directed learning, again, people are looking more at the technical side and how the learner interact with technology or making use of technology. I want to say that in the self-directed learning aspects, the teaching and learning, the two aspects seem to be blurred, that you don't quite distinguish who is doing the teaching, who is doing the learning. It's not as clear cut as in, say, the language classroom. But questions like, how does the learner actually make sense of the learning process? what resources they use and how they use the resources, what strategies they have in using the various resources, and how we as analysts make sense of the learner making sense of their learning process. These are questions that are not really explored very much in the current literature. And these are the questions that I'm particularly interested in. I see there are comments coming up. I'm not sure whether I should, I think they're really about access to the seminar rather than aimed at me, yeah? So I don't need to do anything right now. But I'm looking at self-directed language learning through online platforms and mobile technologies, really by looking at how the two theoretical concepts of multi-competence and translanguaging can be used, can be applied as analytical concepts or lens to this particular situation of language learning. Let me give you a brief review of these two concepts. Multi-competence first. Multi-competence, of course, is what Vivian Cook, my former colleague and good friend, developed in the 80s and early 90s in the field of second language acquisition. So there is quite a lot of resource there online, his own website and also various other websites looking at that particular concept, and also listing all the resources associated with that concept. And we have a handbook together and which summarizes the more recent development. The target of this particular concept, as Vivian Cook developed, was really to challenge the monolingual view of second language learning, moving towards a more bilingual, even multilingual, plurilingual view of second language use. And in this particular respect, he wanted to challenge the division between the learner and user. Really, language learner is a language user as well, and that's one really interesting aspect of language learning. It is really through everyday use. Multi-competence urges us to see second language learning as a process of becoming bilingual, not another monolingual, and that's quite an important underlying argument. And also sees language learning as part of language use and language practice. In many ways, the concept was a major improvement on the system-centered approach that existed at the time. For example, interlanguage, which was very dominant in second language acquisition at the time. It's really moving towards a more user-centered approach to second language acquisition and second language learning. It was built on three premises. Multi-competence concerns the total system for all languages, whether it's L1, L2, or whatever, in a single mind or in a speech community, and their interrelationships. So the interrelationships are just as important as the knowledge of individual languages. Multi-competence does not depend on the monolingual native speaker as the norm, as a model, or as the baseline or the target. Multi-competence affects the whole mind, that is all language and cognitive systems, and that's really important, rather than language alone, and that's what Vivian Cook wanted to emphasize. And that's very different from the so-called multilingual competence, which is competence in different languages or multiple languages. Multi-competence is not just about language alone. That's something that needs to be stressed. It has implications for research design. It wants us to, urges us to look at the interaction between languages, but not one only or one at a time. So that's really important. When you look at multi-competence, we need to look at the interactions between the different languages, not one language at a time. As I said, it really does not rely or depend on the monolingual as a norm. Therefore, it tries to avoid what Vivian called the comparative fallacy. That is, we don't compare the bilingual with the monolingual as if monolingual is the norm or the standard, because we know already that bilinguals are different from monolinguals. And there are also different kinds of bilinguals and multilinguals. And if you want to compare, then the comparison should be between different groups and types of bilinguals and multilinguals rather than between bilingual and monolingual. It also wants to bring in cognitive and semiotic systems, not just narrowly defined linguistic system into the discussion. We should remind ourselves of the purpose of second foreign language or additional language learning. The aim of learning another language is to achieve bilingualism and multilingualism, not to replace the other one. That's not possible. That should never be the goal. But if you look at research and also practice, the bilingual and multilingual language user is rarely used as the model in second language teaching and foreign language teaching. Quite often, we still see monolingual native speaker as the norm, as the standard, as the target. So leaving aside the myth of the monolingual, it's one of those really ill-defined concepts. There's a lot of literature already there critiquing the whole concept. A second or foreign language learner, by definition, can never be another native speaking monolingual in the target language. That's an impossibility. So this connection between language teaching and learning on the one hand, especially second language or foreign language teaching and learning, and the vast amount of research that is already there on bilingualism and multilingualism is rather concerning, because there is work that really shows what we already know about bilinguals and how they behave and their linguistic knowledge. But that is not often used to inform second or foreign language teaching and learning. So we know that bilingualism research and multilingualism research has been critiquing the myth of bilingual as a perfect balanced language user with full proficiencies in all languages really is a myth that doesn't exist. No one can learn the entire language system, whether it's first, second, or foreign. Yeah, and that's, it may sound controversial, but it really is quite straightforward. You cannot possibly know the entire language system, even if you are a native speaker or mother tongue speaker of the language. So in that sense, language learning is a lifelong learning process, truly. And in terms of the existing research on bilingualism, multilingualism, we already know that bilinguals and multilinguals rarely have equal proficiency in all their languages they know and use, even for the so-called simultaneous bilinguals, even for those who grew up with two or more languages. Bilinguals and multilinguals rarely use all their languages equally in all contexts to equal level. And again, that's something we already know. And knowing which language to use to whom and when is an integral part of being bilingual or multilingual. And François Grosjean talks about different language modes. So bilinguals and multilinguals can move between a monolingual mode, which we are in, I suppose, but everybody, I'm sure here, is bilingual and multilingual. We can behave as if we were monolingual. That's because we are in the monolingual mode, but we are also able to use all our languages in the bilingual and multilingual mode. And researchers in bilingualism, multilingualism often claim that code switching between different named languages is the defining behavior of being bilingual when we are in the bilingual mode. It is about the management of different languages in social interaction and the most important aspects of the bilingual knowledge. We know relatively little about the cognitive process of code switching, in fact, and there aren't many models. There's one that my colleague David Green and I suggested a couple of years ago, but it's still being empirically tested and advanced. When Hugo Battens-Biersmore, one of those people who wrote quite extensively on bilingualism in English in the 80s, talked about fears of bilingualism, who's afraid of bilingualism. He talked about parental fear, teachers' fear, cultural fear, societal fear. They were specifically to do with code switching. So it is really to do with the monolingual and linguistic purism ideologies, one language at a time, or one language only kind of ideologies. So having different languages is kind of okay. Yeah, it's in fact, I think we've moved quite a long way since the 80s. So bilingualism, multilingualism on surface is welcome at societal level, and quite often people are praised for knowing several different languages, but mixing them up and switching fluidly between them is still often rejected by society, and certainly in the educational context. I want to also point out that the monolingual ideology that have been talked about also affects our research design. So very often we see in, especially laboratory-based experiments, the ability to separate and differentiate different languages is very often held as a benchmark for competence. And again, we often compare to the monolingual norm, compare how bilinguals and multilinguals behave to a monolingual norm. So in our research in the last few years, we've been quite deliberately trying to avoid that. We don't look at how different bilinguals are from monolinguals. We look at the role of code switching, but we really are looking at the different groups and different bilingual, multilingual experiences of groups of individuals and language users, and looking at how they integrate the different languages in speech production rather than separating them. Having said so much about code switching, I want to really move to a different concept, which is translanguaging. In the last few years, I'm sure all of you are familiar with a shift from a more traditional focus on structural constraints and separation of languages and linguistic structures, which is really the classic code switching approach, to a more integrational approach, looking at how bilinguals, multilinguals integrate different elements from different named languages in a very fluid and coherent manner, in an integrated way. And also move beyond the narrowly focused concept of languaging. So in the last few years, we've been developing the concept of translanguaging with colleagues like Ophelia Garcia and others. I want to give you a quick overview of the concept, of the development of the concept of translanguaging, but many of you are very familiar with that. It, of course, originated in the bilingual, very precisely, it's the revitalization of minority languages in the Welsh context, especially in minority language revitalization context. The person who really talked about it as a conceptual notion was Ken Williams, who was a very experienced teacher trainer. He observed a pedagogical practice in the Welsh revitalization programs, where the pupils would receive information from the teacher in Welsh, as that was the policy of the schools. But they would respond to the teachers very often in English, because all of them, there's no monolingual Welsh speaker, all of them are bilingual and feel more competent and comfortable in English. And of course, also they are receiving information, sometimes through English, sometimes through Welsh, but they also have to produce their coursework in Welsh in one language at a time. Now, rather than seeing this as a problem, Ken Williams, in some sense against the ideology of minority language revitalization, but also against the language policy of these schools, he actually argued that this kind of practice, which he described with a Welsh word, he wrote his doctoral dissertation in Welsh, it helped to maximize the learner's bilingual potential, bilingual ability in learning. So he actually argued very strongly and convincingly that this kind of fluid practice by both the teachers and the pupils maximize their potential in learning. And this concept then was introduced in English to the wider world by his supervisor, Colin Baker, in the textbook Foundations of Bilingual Education, Bilingualism. And he did so by adding the trans prefix to the existing concept of languaging. Languaging has been there for a while. Then, of course, it moved to the field of bilingual, the field of education of bilingual and racialized learners, especially in North America through Ophelia Garcia's work. So translanguaging as a pedagogical practice is seen as very effective, where the school language or the language of instruction is different from the languages of the learner. So in that sense, translanguaging has the potential to empower both the learner and the teacher and helps to transform the power relations between the teacher and the learner. It focuses on the process of teaching and learning, on meaning making and enhancing experience and developing identity. It's really important to point out that translanguaging from day one, the concept of translanguaging from day one was not conceived as an object, or not conceived as a descriptive label. So translanguaging is not an object or linguistic structural phenomena to describe or analyze. It's not a thing in itself. It's a process and it's a practice. It's a practice that involves functionally integrated use of different named languages, as well as different modalities. I'll come to that later on. But it's also a process of knowledge construction that goes beyond, that's the whole idea of transcending the trans prefix, beyond the boundaries of named languages. There is a different origin of the concept of translanguaging. As I said, when Colin Baker introduced the concept, he added the trans to languaging, and languaging, of course, has been there for some time in distributed cognition, distributed language work, but also in anthropological linguistics, as Pete Baker, who was an anthropological linguist, argued very strongly that there is no such thing as language, only continual activity of languaging. And language is very much a secondary or second order outcome of the continuing process, first order activity of languaging. This is connected to Miriam Swain's work in sociocultural theory of second language acquisition, where she used the concept of languaging to talk about the cognitive process of negotiating, producing meaningful, comprehensible output as part of language learning as a means to mediate cognition. So she looked at advanced second language learners who are able to come to know while speaking or talk it through the kind of meta-languaging process. And it's really interesting that she linked languaging with cognizing, consciousness, thinking. So in this way, when we link translanguaging with languaging, building on the previous work on translanguaging, we want to go beyond the advanced second language learners, as Miriam Swain did, to include different types of multilingual language users. I want to capture their ability to talk it through in multiple languages, however incomplete or truncated their knowledge of the individual languages may be. So the previous work on the advanced language, second language learners really wanted to show that languaging was an indicator of advanced ability, language ability, that they can talk things through the second language that they're learning. But we want to really look at how emerging bilinguals and emerging multilinguals can talk it through in multiple languages, even if you have incomplete or the so-called incomplete and truncated knowledge of individual languages, because we don't believe there is ever going to be a complete knowledge of any language, even if you are a native speaker. So in this sense, it wants to capture the entirety of the learner's linguistic repertoire, rather than knowledge of specific structures of specific languages separately. So it's really connected with the multi-competence concept that Vivian Cook talked about. I want to say that the concept of translanguaging, and in fact the concept of languaging in particular, is associated with the ecological psychology or distributed cognition and distributed language research, which is very extensive, and you can find a lot of work in these journals. The languaging scholars define it as an assemblage of diverse material, biological, semiotic, and cognitive properties and capacities, which languaging agents, that is us, language users, orchestrate. It's a very important metaphor, orchestrate in different time, in real time, and across a diversity of timescales. They urge us to move away. They want to challenge the so-called code view. This is why people working with the concept of translanguaging do not use the other conventional concept like code switching, because we want to challenge the code view of language. And we don't believe that people are simply mechanically switching back and forward, but actually integrate elements of different languages and different cognitive and semiotic systems in a very complex way. So again, they regard language as a second order construct, the product of first order activity, which is languaging. Human languaging activity is radically heterogeneous and involves the interaction of processes on many different time scales, including neural, bodily, situational, social, and cultural processes and events. And Paul Thibault wrote in his very important paper in 2016. He has a 2-volume book coming out with Routledge very soon. So this kind of approach really wants us to rethink language not as an organism-centered entity with corresponding formalism or structures, but as a multi-scalar organization of processes that enables the bodily and situated to interact with situation, transcending, again, this really important word, transcending cultural, historical dynamics and practices. And from this point of view, the divides between, the conventional divides between linguistic, the paralinguistic, and the extralinguistic dimensions of human communication seem to be meaningless and nonsensical. Again, this metaphor of orchestration is really interesting because we're looking at how meaning is made through multiple channels, through multi-modalities, of which language is only one of the possible means of communication. It's like music making. It's like making orchestral music or listening to orchestral music, for example. We don't pay attention to one instrument only, but it's an orchestrated process. This orchestration of neural, bodily, worldly skills of languaging. They also emphasize the importance of feeling, emotion, experience, history, memory, subjectivity, and culture. They don't talk about ideology and power as such, but it's easy to integrate these into the discussion as well. They're equally important in this complex process. The languaging scholars have a very specific view or perspective on language learning as well, and this is also relevant to the current discussion. That is, the novice or the learner does not acquire language in that conventional sense of second language acquisition, but rather they adapt their bodies and brains to the languaging activity that surrounds them. And in doing so, they participate in the cultural worlds and learn they can get things done with others in accordance with the culturally promoted norms and values. So this is very similar, or at least very closely connected with the language socialization theories and approaches, and also complex dynamic system approach to second language learning. Now, by adding the trans prefix to languaging, of course, we want to better capture the multilingual language users' creative and dynamic practices, but we also want to raise some other theoretical arguments along the way. One is about language and thought. So one of the things we want to put forward is a hypothesis that multilinguals do not think unilingually, even when we are in the so-called monolingual mode and producing one language only. So just think what role or impact the other languages we know on the process of on the processing of one language only at the moment. You know, we are communicating through English only, but the other languages absolutely play a role on the way we think. And the other hypothesis we want to put forward is human beings think beyond language, and thinking requires the use of a variety of cognitive, semiotic, and modal resources, of which language in its conventional sense of speech and writing is only one. And again, this is really to bring in the multimodalities, multi-semantic, semiotic, and cognitive cues and resources that people have to use in communication. We are doing a multimodal communication right now as we speak. So I've been talking about the so-called translanguaging instinct. It really builds along the argument that human beings have an innate capacity to acquire languages and to use languages. And of course, others have argued for the interactional instinct. For the language instinct to be triggered, we have to have an innate desire and capacity to interact with others. We also have an innate drive to go beyond narrowly defined linguistic cues and transcend the culturally defined language boundaries. So when we, for example, when we hear a new expression from somebody, we don't, and we may not understand exactly what it means, but we don't habitually ask that person to repeat the same thing again and again. That does not help. We will try to draw cues from that person's facial expression, body posture, and other things, and other cues. And if we are processing some information online, we're not just looking at the language, we're looking at the color scheme and other, you know, the way it's presented and the environmental information to go beyond the narrowly defined linguistic cues, try to transcend these boundaries in order to infer information and get more information out of the cue presented to us. So this is, you know, compared to the so-called principle of economy in standard linguistic theory, we're talking about a more maximalist approach to human communication, the principle of abundance. That is, multiple cues are present simultaneously in producing a message. And human beings have a natural instinct to draw on as many different sensory, modal, cognitive, semiotic resources as available to them to interpret the meaning, intentions, while assessing the relative relevance and significance of the different cues. And we have that innate ability. Now, sometimes that ability can be impaired. So there will be people who have difficulty processing multiple information, multiple types of information cues simultaneously. And those are interesting cases for us to investigate, of course. Now, these cues also complement and compensate each other. Human beings read them in a coordinated manner rather than singularly. Yeah. Again, it could be impaired, that ability could be impaired, resulting in some cases of only reading into one cue at a time. And we know the consequences of that. But for the majority of us, we have that capacity to read all these different cues that's simultaneously presented to us in a coordinated manner and evaluate their relevant relative significance. So having outlined the conceptual frameworks, I'm going to show you a case study of translanguaging learning in action, which is really about self-directed language learning with online platforms. And this case is a study done by my former PhD student Jennifer Ho, who's working in City University of Hong Kong. With other colleagues who are working on multimodalities, Kara Druid and Jeff Besmore. And it is about online learning, mobile learning, self-directed learning, informal learning, and specifically about learning Chinese by online platforms. Informal learning, mobile learning is basically learning undertaken individually or collectively on their own without externally imposed criteria or structure or an authorized instructor. That's the definition of informal mobile learning. With digital technology, individuals can learn on the go and making learning quite flexible at any time, and they have their control of what they can learn, when they want to learn, and how much they learn at a time. And the internet, of course, opens up all these opportunities for us to do that. In this case, we're looking at individual adult learners of Chinese engaging in self-directed learning of Chinese characters in this particular case via a platform called Memrise. I think some of you will be familiar with this. It's actually multilingual, so you can learn all sorts of languages. I'm going to show you a quick case, a video of a learner we call George, who's an Australian and in his early 30s. He's been teaching in China for a little while. He knew some Chinese, he's learned some Chinese, and he's also attending one-to-one tuition for his spoken Chinese, but he's using Memrise in addition to learn Chinese characters. And we've done interviews about his motivation, his learning strategy, and his learning environment. And there's some information there. I can leave that with you. The video is a short sample of him trying to learn the meaning, the function, the shape, and also the sound, the pronunciation of an adverb meaning perhaps or. And this is part of the learning program of the first 500 characters in Mandarin Chinese, which the platform helps him to do. So let me try to get to the video. This is Oh, by the way, this is the transcript I was going to show you later on. So this is all created, this transcript. So you have the time, the speech, the actual screenshot, what he's doing in terms of typing, and our comments, etc. I'll come back to that later. So this is the video I'm going to show. Yeah, this is a different character that he was learning previously. Now moving to the target.
Now, the only reason I'm writing perhaps is because it says adverb underneath, and it is perhaps. I wanted to.
He has to work out the meaning of it first.
Because it's literally saying adverb.
Professor Li Wei?
Yeah, sorry.
We can't see the video, I'm sorry.
Oh, I see. So
I think you would have to stop sharing the screen and then start
share
again.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay, thank you. Oh, we can see it now, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, this is a previous character he was learning. Now moving on to this one. So first he has to work out the meaning of it.
Now, the only reason I'm writing perhaps is because it says adverb underneath, and it is perhaps. I wanted opinion. Oh, they wanted opinion. So I know it's the perhaps one, but that's because it's literally saying adverb to me, and I wouldn't have guessed it otherwise. I just know I've done the adverb perhaps. I don't know what the opinion is. Let's go with GM.
Yeah, it's guessing the pronunciation, but it isn't.
Cool. 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 You can see I've chosen the mem. Perhaps there's a lance in my mouth.
Okay, what Memorize does, if you're not familiar, is asking you to create a meme to use as an aid for your own learning, so that you can remember the shape of the character, the pronunciation, and the meaning in one go. So you have to create a little story, I guess. You can build a story on the basis of what other learners have done. So George can access other people's creation. So he's got one there.
Oh my, doesn't really help me at all. Oh my. Perhaps there's a lance in my mouth. Cool. Perhaps. What is going on?
Well, when you are doing self-directed learning, this kind of thing happens all the time. So you have to deal with it.
Unless, not liking this capturing thing. That's all right. Cool. Now, to me, that looks like the side of war. I'm not sure if it is, but it looks like the side of war. And then that dash, the DN dash, and then the coal. I don't know what that looks like.
It's trying to make sense of the character by drawing some, by drawing on what he already knows of other characters. And that's really interesting there.
Obviously, that's the land, that isn't at the side of the war. I don't know how to remember this, perhaps. There's just no logical connection for me. Perhaps there's a lance in my mouth. If I knew that was lance, I'd probably get one better. But how to make it war? I know fire is war.
So again, he's drawing on
Maybe I can think of
information he already knows, his prior knowledge.
The mouth would be very painful like fire.
He's beginning to make sense of this now. He's creating a little story.
make some sort of logical. So what I'm gonna do, perhaps there's a lance in my mouth. This is how I make the mem. So I'm actually gonna make that. Perhaps there's a, I'll make the mem. Choose another one. Can I make that? Yeah. So I'm going to steal the, perhaps there's a lance in my mouth. Perhaps there's lance.
He's using the capital letters very strategically.
Because I might be able to remember that. And then for the pronunciation, so the lance hurts like fire, which is war.
Yeah.
War. I'm doing war, right? It's fire, right?
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. I'll go back to the PowerPoint, which has disappeared. Now that's interesting. The PowerPoint has disappeared. I can't. Okay, I've got the PowerPoint now. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm going back to the PowerPoint. Yeah, you can see actually this is a really rather complex process if you look at it in detail, which in the literature on online self-directed online learning using online platforms or mobile technologies, there's very little discussion of exactly how a learner uses their own agency to make sense of what they're learning, how to what strategies they use to draw out of the information from what they can see in front of them, and the various resources that they have to use in this self-directed learning. So we can see here making meaning making really involves very careful orchestration of multiple semiotic and modal resources. He's constantly talking to himself. Initially we thought this is weird, he's always talking, but Jennifer looked at about 20 different learners and we recorded them all, and there's just so many things that in common amongst these learners, and he's just one example really. They're always talking to themselves, they're thinking aloud, they're looking, they're reading, they're moving their mouths, typing, reading the picture, the image, and imagining other pictures and images and signs and creating their own. He's trying out the pronunciation and trying to memorize the pronunciation and linking the pronunciation with other images and signs and making connections across. It's really a very, very elaborate and complex process is doing there. In some sense, it reminds me of the cases that Mira Swain discussed, talking it through. But this is much more elaborate and cross-modal, of course, multimodal and cross-modal. So he's doing meaning making through two languages as well, creating a story in English about a Chinese character and bits of information about Chinese radicals that make up the character already embedded in the story, but also he had some knowledge of other characters as well. He's drawing on that knowledge. Now, methodologically, there's a real challenge of how do we analyze this holistically and really in a coordinated way. As I showed you briefly, the way we've designed a kind of multimodal transcript, but really, I think it's still a very flat way of representing what's going on. We really have to show you the video, and in fact, you know, you can have data on, you can have eye tracking data, see where he's working, and you can have mouse tracking data, see how he's typing this thing out. And sometimes people use touch technology to create the meme as well. Yeah, I mean, there's another example, but this is really a detailed analysis of the different components of the different transformations that he is going through in terms of meaning of the word, the form of the word, the spoken form, the pronunciation, and he's using capital words, capitalizing the words that is related to the target and that aids his memory. And he has to include meaning, written form, and spoken form all together in this new meme he's creating. So I want to just draw things together now. In this changing world, I mean, we know that the world of language learning is really changing very, very fast. Language learning can and does take place everywhere, on the street, at work, on holidays, online, through pop music, computer games, in some rather impoverished and dangerous and traumatic environment too. And at any time, day or night, childhood, adulthood, later in life, and language learning is no longer just for educational qualification or status, and certainly not for spreading Western wisdom and knowledge, as it were, to the uncivilized. The purpose of language learning is more likely to be for tourism, entertainment, marriage and personal relations, and in the case of refugees and other individuals under exploitation, very basic survival. So what is interesting about all of this type of language learning, as opposed to instructed classroom-based language learning, which really for the majority of people is a really rare occasion. Language learning in these cases is informal, piecemeal, mobile, and most importantly, multimodal. Language learning has always been multimodal, and for a child learning first language, it's always multimodal. Actions always comes before the sound and the written form. So we have to look at the complexities of informal learning, the whole process of informal learning from that coordinated and complex way. The multiplexity of resources, there's no single source of knowledge or no single source of information that dominates everything. So the learner has to have quite a high level of agency and creativity in order to assess the relevant importance of the information, of the cues, of the resources that they're presented with. The concept of multi-competence is concerned with the total system for all languages, not one language only, or one language at a time, in a single mind and community, and most importantly, their interrelationships. And translanguaging aims to transcend the boundaries between named languages. So they are connected in that sense. And they help to understand the complexity of how people making sense of the language learning process. Multi-competence does not depend on the monolingual native speaker as the norm. And translanguaging focuses on the multilinguals everyday practice is only compares amongst different types of multilinguals and how different language experiences impact on their behavior and cognition. Again, when we look at different learners of Chinese using online platforms, we're not comparing them to either a monolingual Chinese person or other learners in different contexts, but we're looking at this group of people, how they draw their own personal experiences and language experiences as well, and how that impacts on their new learning experience in this particular environment. Multi-competence affects the whole mind, all language and cognitive systems, rather than language alone, and translanguaging aims to overcome the lingual bias, as some people talked about. So I want to leave today's discussion with a question, as it were, for all of us to consider. I hope I've made a case to you that translanguaging is an everyday activity that we're all engaged in. And we, in terms of learning new languages, the objective has to be, or should be, because it's about becoming bilingual and multilingual, not replacing our first language. So can the objective of language learning, foreign language, second language learning especially, should it be or can it be translanguaging for us? Should we be using translanguaging to teach, but also setting translanguaging the ability to go beyond different languages and beyond the boundaries of language and other semiotic and cognitive systems as the objective for language learning? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Li Wei, for this fascinating presentation. I think everybody can give a virtual round of applause if they want to show appreciation. Thank you very much. We'll now open the floor to questions. So if you'd like, participants, you can post your questions now in the chat. Thank you.